Cost-benefit analysis, expressing a sustainable spirit. In this episode, we have a special treat. We'll be interviewing Dr. Alex Heil, Chief Economist for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Hello, Dr. Heil.
Good morning, David. Thanks for having me.
Could you say a little bit more about what you do at Port Authority?
Sure. I can expand a little bit on that, as well as my background. So I've been with the Port Authority now for nearly a decade. I manage a small group of economists in the planning department, and that group focuses on cost-benefit analysis as part of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Prior to joining the agency, I was a consultant for an environmental engineering firm. We did a fair bit of cost-benefit analysis work there as well. The focus was on municipal management consulting, so public sector, looking at wastewater, water, energy, stormwater utilities, and some of the investments they make, and in particular how some of these investments should be prioritized. So it's that question of prioritization that I have spent pretty much the last 20 years of my career, and that's what I also do at the Port Authority right now.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about cost-benefit analysis and why it's important?
Sure. I think we're all aware that in a climate of limited resources, limited budgets, and financial constraints, it's important to make decisions that maximize benefits or, with an economic lens, maximize utility for decision makers. So cost-benefit analysis is one tool that allows us to do that. And the mechanism by which cost-benefit analysis does this is looks at all the benefits that are associated with a build case. So one differentiates between essentially the status quo or the no-build case, so a continuation of current circumstances into the future, or whatever the time frame is of the analysis, and we can come to time frame a little bit later on because that's important. But then one defines a build case. So what's the engineering alternative? What are the details of the project that need to be built? And what are the marginal changes between the build and the no-build case? Then analysts would look at those differences in terms of transportation efficiencies, time savings, public health improvements, climate change effects, and project those out over the time frame of the analysis, and with guidance, with experience, with some of the input parameters given by other agencies or that one develops oneself, you can monetize some of these changes. Monetizing simply means that you put a dollar value on a benefit or a cost that otherwise may not be priced in a market framework. So it's not a readily available price, but is a valuation of a benefit that can then be added together to the total benefit of a project. And once the total benefit of the project is determined on a present value basis, that can then be compared to the total present value of cost. And as long as the ratio between the two is greater than 1, in other words, as long as the discounted future benefits are exceeding the discounted future cost, the project from a cost-benefit perspective is desirable.
Excellent. So could you go a little bit further into the notion of present value and why is that so important in cost-benefit analysis?
Sure. Present value is a financial computational tool that allows us to consider how benefits and costs accrue over the time frame of analysis. So we're all aware of time value of money. So a dollar received today is valued differently than a dollar received a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because of the opportunity cost of money, because of preferences, liquidity, and such. So when you consider benefits or costs that are incurred in the future, they need to be discounted back to the present period. So there are several different considerations that are important here. The first one, in my view, is what's the time frame of the analysis? So it's important to view a time frame in line with the expected life of an asset. So, for instance, if we're talking about a transportation asset that has an expected life of 25 years, that's also the period of time during which one should be considering benefits and cost. It gets a little bit more problematic if one considers the time frame for longer lasting assets, because the further out we go, the more uncertainty there is, and the more one runs into issues of discounting actually diminishing future benefits to the extent that they are rarely counted, which brings me to the second point, and that's really the choice of the discount rate. So discounting is part of the time value of money computation that is being done, and it's just simply essentially a representation of the opportunity cost of having benefits and cost incur in different time periods. So if one, for instance, takes discount rates, social discount rates, in other words, for projects that have a social benefit component to them, that are not looked at as a financial cost benefit analysis, and I probably should have differentiated this earlier. If we're saying a financial cost benefit analysis, that's something that Amazon would do. If they're saying, oh, are we going to build a new warehouse? Yes or no? That's a financial cost benefit analysis. For them, the choice of discount rate is very straightforward because they're just looking at the opportunity cost of fundraising for them. So it's the weighted average cost of capital that determines the discount rate.
So that would be, for example, something related to an interest rate?
Yes, that's the blended mix between essentially the cost of their debt and their cost of their equity. And whatever that's different for every corporation, for every business entity, but it's much more transparent. The choice of that is much more transparent. If we're talking about projects that have a social component to them, so in other words, there are environmental changes, environmental benefits, environmental improvements, may they be related to climate change or not. If we're talking about public health effects, so for instance, life expectancy might be increased as a result of a medical intervention, then those benefits that accrue to the general public, they're usually discounted by using a social discount rate. There's a lot of literature out on social discount rates. They tend to be lower than discount rates used for financial cost benefit analysis. Guidance that we do at the port is anywhere around 3%, 3 to 4% that we use for public benefit type projects. If you look at this throughout the world, different countries have published different guidelines on those kind of discount rates. For instance, the UK has published information on even declining discount rates. So they said if it's a relatively short-term project, 20 years, well, it's fine to use 3-4%. But then once you get into the longer lasting projects, some of these discount rates should actually be declining in the later part of the project. And the reason for that is if you discount $1 of benefit that is accrued 100 years from now, even at 3%, it essentially disappears because the time, the discounting, the present value calculation, the mathematics of it make the benefit near zero at that point, which brings up an interesting point of intergenerational equity. There's also literature out there that said, well, discounting is problematic because by discounting at all, you're essentially creating a bias towards present consumption and you're taking away from future consumption. So a climate change type project, for instance, a big seawall that is going to be built to protect an urban area from sea level rise or storm surges in the future, well, if that is expected to be there for the next 100 or 150 years, any benefit for people not yet born would basically be discounted away by even a choice of a 2-3% discount rate. So there is, if you look into areas of ecological economics, what researchers in that area would propose is saying maybe you should be discounting at all, 0% discount rate. And some of the interesting work on climate change effects, the cost of climate change, they actually assume discount rates that are very much near zero in order to reestablish some of these intergenerational equities. So to give you a long-winded answer to your question, really the present value calculation is important. I think it gets problematic once you look at very long time frames because of the uncertainty. I think one needs to be very careful with the choice of discount rates because there's a clear bias. The higher the discount rate, a bias towards present period consumption or current consumption. And the other problem that one runs into with these kind of calculations is if you have projects of different length, different lives, and you calculate present values, then sometimes just having a longer lasting project, if you compare two project alternatives, one is longer lasting than the other, you may simply be adding benefits over a longer period of time that may not make the project more desirable per se, but it just creates a little bit more of a complication in the calculation. So it's just something to look out for.
So may I follow up with a couple of questions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So one thing it sounds like is, as you were saying, 20-year project is one thing, but if it's a 50-year project or a 100-year project, so a 50-year project might be a bridge?
For instance, yeah.
For instance, okay. So would you say then that one of the challenges is that at the end of a project, there's going to be some kind of disposal cost?
Yes, that has happened. Salvage value, the way one deals with the salvage value at the end of a project is important. I think, for instance, in the nuclear industry, maybe too little emphasis has been placed on what actually happens to some of the fuel that was used in a generation of electricity, because the costs are astronomical for decommissioning of plants and equipment 50 years into the future. That's certainly true. I think one needs to be aware of that. The other problem with some of these concepts are that if one builds a road, if one builds a bridge, an airport, the assumption usually is that the asset will continue to exist to perpetuity. Nobody makes necessarily the assumption that, in 50 years from now, when we need to repave this road, one of the alternatives is just to get rid of it. No, we'll have development around it. People will have lived there for a while. Businesses will have settled in that area. And all of a sudden, it's no longer a feasible option to say that we're going to decommission this asset. So in a lot of cost-benefit work, it's really just an artificial cutoff, where one basically says, look, the time frame is 30 years, 50 years, 75 years, whatever, and we're just going to ignore anything beyond that. I think, that's a little bit of a shortcut. That's a little bit of a mistake to make in many cases in these kind of calculations, but it's sometimes the only way to do this. Some of the agencies that publish guidelines on cost-benefit work, like the Department of Transportation or the FAA for aviation projects, they do provide guidelines on the number of years that should be used for different types of assets. And they recognize in their guidelines that anything beyond that is just going to be ignored. So just use 30 years, 25 years. From my perspective, and that's true for everything around cost-benefit analysis, it's all about transparency. I think it's fine to say I'm going to choose a particular artificial time frame, and then I'm going to disclose that in the report that I'm writing in the way that this is communicated. And also I need to be aware at that point that I document to what extent the results and the conclusion are sensitive to that assumption. So the sensitivity of this is important. And as long as that's done, I would feel comfortable that the analysis is robust and legit.
Okay, so when we're talking about sensitivity, we're talking about using different discount rates.
For instance, if one says, you're building a new road and that's going to lower the travel time for people, and there are different ways one could estimate travel time, then you could run a sensitivity analysis around the different travel times. Any kind of input parameter can be made subject to a sensitivity analysis. I think when one then evaluates the results and the findings of a cost-benefit analysis, you're looking for robustness. You're looking for what are the results under different variations of input parameters, and as long as they also, so to speak, point in the right direction, the same direction, and all support the same conclusion, then you're on safe ground. The moment you run into problems is if you run a sensitivity analysis and you're saying, at a discount rate of 6%, the results are, you should construct this project. But then once you go to 3%, it's a no-go decision. Then you have to struggle a little bit in how to get this all sorted out at that point.
Okay. So the importance of the robustness is that it should still look good from a wide range of perspectives.
Yes, the findings shouldn't change just because, I mean, it's entirely possible that the findings change. If you vary an input parameter to an analysis, let's say you do a climate change type project and it's all about the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, well, the social cost of carbon, that price, that's an important input parameter. And if you're using $40 a ton, $60 a ton, whatever other value you might want to use, depending on that input parameter, you may get different results for a project. As long as these results support the same overall conclusion, you're on safe ground. If you change the parameter and that leads you to a different conclusion, that's when you have to take a second look.
Okay. How does change in population over time affect, for example, how you might discount? In other words, if you start off with a population of 20 million for the area of the project that you're working with, certainly over 30, 40 years, you don't expect it to stay at 20 million. Mm-hmm. Let's say the population doubles. Is there an argument for, in some sense, saying, well, 40 million as compared to 20 million, maybe the future should be weighted more, not less?
I think one can certainly make an argument like that. I think it's all a question of how that growth is factored into the analysis. In infrastructure work, a lot of that growth may be factored in the definition of a no build, of a base case, of a status quo. So if you're saying, oh, we're dealing with the greater New York City region and, 18 counties, 20-some counties is a big area. It's 20 plus million people living there. And over the next 50 years, that's expected to go up by X%, right? So maybe that's your definition of your baseline against which you're then comparing your project case, your build case. I think at that point, you've taken it into consideration. However, one can certainly make the argument that some of the trade-offs change when there's more scarcity, when the overall structure of the region changes, when basically the way that people use resources in 50 years from now is going to be different than it is today. I think that's a fair point. For me, it always comes down to addressing some of these subtleties and some of these nuances in the discussion of the analysis. So the cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day is also just a computational tool that leads you to a net present value or cost-benefit ratio, whatever it is that you're looking at. But you need to also provide a narrative around it. And that's very important because the world is complicated and complex. And I think that needs to be accounted for as well. So that you raise a good point.
So what, based on what you said before, you do your analysis and you do your sensitivity and you present your results. What challenges do you have going from sort of like doing the scientific, technical work, backing it, to maybe something in the political realm where someone else will take it and maybe they don't put in all the subtleties when they present it. They'll just say, oh, this is good or this is bad. Do you run into that?
Yeah, I think as any kind of analyst or economist, it's hard not to run into this. I think that there's different lenses that are put on a project and analysis. And certainly, some political lenses would, at the end of the day, argue that, this is a desirable project despite a CBA not delivering a beneficial result. Or the other way around. Oh, the CBA says this is great, but for political reasons, it shouldn't be done. So I think these are not mutually exclusive, the areas. So there is overlap. So I feel that there needs to be communication between the two sets of goals and the two sets of objectives. And it's certainly true that maybe for practical reasons, for overall, it's entirely true that this also sometimes happens that you have a list of projects and you prioritize them all and they all come out to be super beneficial with cost-benefit ratios of 3-to-1 or higher. And so, in other words, discounted future net benefits are, 3 times greater than discounted future present value cost, but you don't have funding for all of them. So at that point, even a cost-benefit analysis that delivers a positive result and a go decision for a project does still not mean that the project will receive funding. So I think it's always important to keep in mind that any project that is being evaluated and assessed needs to be looked at from different perspectives. And CBA is one of the tools. Let me give you another related example that I think touches on this as well. What I've also done frequently over the last few years is economic impact analysis, which is completely different from cost-benefit analysis, which looks at expenditures on assets or infrastructure really sort of from a Keynesian multiplier perspective. So you spend $1 billion on a bridge. How much activity does that generate in a regional economy? How much employment does that support? How much wages does that support that particular type of investment? I found over the years that's very those results, those estimates are very attractive politically because they big inputs generate big outputs in that case, because it's a fairly linear process actually. But it's not a decision-making tool. It's just not something that should be used to decide if a project should be funded, because it may be good information to have, and different projects, depending on the kind of resources that they use, may have different impacts, even if the overall investment is identical in each. But it's an additional perspective to put to a project, but it shouldn't be one that is the sole decision-making factor.
Okay, so that distinction between cost-benefit analysis and economic impact, would it be fair to say that at the core of cost-benefit is you're trying to decide, is it worth it or not? Whereas with economic impact, it's sort of, cluing in the policymakers. Well, if we do this, these are the things you should keep in mind, that will come along with it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's important in economic impact analysis to realize that, if done properly, you do account, for instance, for different origins of resource flows. And if you're saying, we're looking at the state of New Jersey and we're looking at a road construction project and most of the materials come in from Pennsylvania, let's say, most of the cement and asphalt and whatever one uses to build roads. So the greater the so-called regional purchase coefficient, right? So the greater the percentage of resources that are sourced regionally, the greater the economic impact. And the more comes in from outside of whatever the area of analysis is, in this case, the state of New Jersey, the smaller the economic impact that is associated with this kind of investment. That's not going to make it good or bad. That just speaks to some of the distributional effects of how resource flows should or should not be counted. So I think that's then simply a useful tool to look at a project and say, these are the kind of industries that are likely to have more demand for goods and services, and these are the ones that have less demand as a result of this particular project. And even saying, this is within and outside of the region, you can draw some differences there. Yes, I think it's sort of an additional layer one can put on a project.
Interesting. In basic economics, that almost sounds like the difference in impact between a closed and an open economy.
Right. I think it's conceptually quite related to that.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any other issues in doing a cost-benefit analysis that you haven't stated that yet that you'd like to?
Yeah. Let me sort of expand a little bit on. We've talked now for a while, and we've basically made a relatively strong case that cost-benefit analysis is a useful tool for decision making, and that's certainly true. I teach a course in cost-benefit analysis, and I always tell my students that it's a great tool to analyze the desirability of a project. It's a great tool not just because of the results that it delivers, the bottom line to a project, but it also forces an analyst to look at the different benefits components, the different costs, to really scrutinize what goes into a project, who's going to be affected and how. And that really then gets to the point of what also the problems are with cost-benefit analysis, because it's So there's a few of them. One is if a benefit can't be measured, it also will not show up in cost-benefit analysis. So there are many cases where, I think we've gone a long way in this country to come up with valuations for air pollutions, for instance, and for putting valuations on carbon emissions to the environment. And now they could be included in an analysis, but years ago when those numbers weren't necessarily as solid enough, they were left out in many cases. And what does that then mean? That still means that the project has beneficial components that would touch the environment, for instance, but just because we can't put a dollar value on it, we're not counting them. So sometimes that creates a bias in the project calculation that should be calculated. And, we've moved a long way here on the environmental side. But even now with public health considerations, with other considerations, livability of community, quality of life, how people perceive certain projects, what are some of these softer characteristics, hard to measure. If something's hard to measure, it's hard to include in CBA. That doesn't necessarily mean that it should be excluded, but it should probably be added in the narrative and in the description of benefits, but it will not show up in the numbers. Another issue I find with cost-benefit analysis is it looks at just simply the comparison of benefits and cost and uses that as the decision maker for a project, the go-ahead or the stop decision in that case. But it's also entirely possible that there's an agenda that would argue, well, there are socially desirable assets and investments that should be made. And even though they may not pencil out from a cost-benefit perspective, let's say as a country we should have rail service that services the entire country. And even though that will cover some relatively low-density part of the country for which it's hard to argue that it's cost-beneficial to do so, but maybe there is an overall social goal of providing affordable rail service. And, I'm talking about sort of really inner city rail service, but you can make the same argument for transit, that transit should be cheap, that there should be mobility. And if you ran the numbers on cost benefit, that may mean that transit funding is not cost beneficial, but that is not meaning that it's not socially desirable. So I think that's always a struggle with that. And the other one is certainly distribution. And I think that's very important. So, the title of your podcast series is As It Relates to Freedom. So, from the freedom perspective here, I think it's important to keep in mind that, the moment that you have in an intertemporal decision-making process where you balance resources used today against benefits and utility generated in the future, you do make a decision about that particular trade-off. By financing projects today, you can guarantee benefits in the future, and that also then, assures freedom for future generations because they can do more than they otherwise would. However, there's always an opportunity cost. There's always an opportunity cost with all of these things, so that needs to be considered. In terms of this whole, once you put the freedom lens on this, and you also talk about distribution, it's important to keep in mind that cost-benefit analysis lumps all these benefits together. It does not look at this from the point of view of individual stakeholders. So if you take, for instance, and this is near and dear to my area of work, so you use another transportation example. If you're talking about a transportation project that affects different parts of a community, some of which might be higher income, some of whom might be lower income, then computationally, the higher income individuals, they have a greater value of time. And therefore, any kind of time savings will count more heavily because the benefit is greater. An hour saved for a hedge fund manager counts more than an hour saved for a janitor. So that may not be fair, but that's certainly what cost-benefit implies in that case, in terms of what their monetized value of time is. But then that also means that projects that benefit more higher income stakeholders will have, by definition, greater benefits and will therefore come out to be more beneficial. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, because if you apply the lens of freedom, then you shouldn't draw the distinction and the border around the high income parts of your city or your community, because it's a question of how projects affect everybody. And they can be quite exclusionary if you're not aware of how some of these different valuations affect different stakeholders.
Interesting. So in the same way, present value, discounts the future relative to today, you're indicating that cost-benefit analysis with respect to distribution effects, there's a discounting of those that have low incomes relative to high incomes.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very important to keep in mind. That's why, some agencies that publish guidelines on cost-benefit analysis and input parameters, what kind of income values of time, value of air emissions, value of any other, environmental effects, how you should be putting a dollar value on that. They use uniform values in order to assess projects, and the reason is to simply take out some of these variations and make sure that some of these projects are assessed. Now, it is true that some projects affect different stakeholders unequally. So again, for me, it comes back to transparency. So I don't have a problem using a cost-benefit approach and say the aggregate benefit from a project is X, and X may be greater than Y, the present value cost, and therefore the project on paper appears desirable and it should be funded. That's great. I think as a subtext to this, that is important. One should then also talk about what these benefits are, how different benefits compare to each other. So is there one particular benefit category that overwhelms all others? Are there, because of the way they're calculated, certain ones that completely disappear? To relate to what I was saying earlier, are there entire benefit categories that are not included because we weren't able to estimate them? So that's one part of this discussion. And the second part is who benefits most and who may actually lose out as part of a project and may then get, even though on paper in the aggregate the project may appear desirable and beneficial for society, there may still be groups as part of, that will be affected adversely as part of a project. And that may be coming back to your point of, if how benefit cost analysis is used and how decisions should be made. Sometimes it's the distributional effects that are most important in a project. And as long as there is a group of stakeholders that is negatively affected, maybe the project is not desirable from society's point of view. And it's really not just a utilitarian approach of looking at aggregate benefits, but maybe there's a minimum benefit that should be reached for everyone, and only if that's the case, a project should be funded. So I think it gets very complex. It gets a little complicated once you sort of tease some of these results apart. That's why transparency is so important.
So with respect to sustainability, would it be fair to say that the notion of a minimum benefit or making sure that those that might be least advantaged or most disadvantaged are compensated in some way, or on the other side, those that benefit the most from it in some sense might pay more in the future because they're receiving greater benefits. How would that relate to again sustainability and whether or not the community even continues to exist as we understand it when you're having such distribution effects?
I think, that's a complicated question. I think it's certainly true that if you look at cost-benefit analysis, this whole compensation, cost-benefit analysis assumes that it's not, a project may not be Pareto efficient, essentially. I mean, you're not looking at this, and it's the aggregate benefits that count. And that means... Can
you do me a favor for our listeners?
Oh, yes.
Just describe what
situation where
Pareto efficiency.
And a Pareto improvement would be a move where you make someone better off without making someone else at the same time worse off. So that's essentially the gold standard, where you're not taking away benefits from one person in order to just redistribute them to another. So cost-benefit analysis does not meet that standard because there may be groups of people that are negatively affected, to your point. Cost-benefit analysis also doesn't go as far, though, and then say, these people should be compensated. Yes, I think hypothetically you could compensate them. That's true. So if you take a toll road, there are plenty of toll roads in Southern California and in Texas that have been built where people pay to drive on a highway and save time. And it's true that the people with higher income, they have higher valuations of time, and therefore they're more willing to pay. And others with lower incomes, they don't have the means to afford the road, and therefore they get pushed into even more congested surface roads on the side, and they're actually negatively affected. Now, if you put a dollar value on the benefits of these high income earners that are now having a free and uncongested road experience, you could take some of that benefit away via taxes, via fees, and could redistribute that to some of the lower income individuals. Cost-benefit analysis does not require that to occur because it's a paper exercise, right? It's simply saying there's the hypothetical case where one could be compensated, but what we're saying is we're going to reach a result from a utilitarian societal approach that does not mandatorily redistribute money from greater beneficiaries to smaller beneficiaries. I think from the sustainability argument, it's certainly true that should be considered in terms of how societies perceive projects, how societies perceive some of the investments that government in particular makes to enhance quality of life by citizens. From my perspective, I look at this and think that, well, maybe we should make a first decision on if the project should be funded. And then once the project is funded, and because it came out positively, beneficial in a cost-benefit analysis, then there's a whole nother layer here of revenue collection for the project. And that could then very much take into consideration a beneficiary pay principle where people with greater benefits should actually be paying more to reestablish some equity and actually come much closer to sort of a compensatory mechanism that would allow for greater fairness in how society's resources are allocated. So I think those are all important considerations. That's why I find it so important to clearly identify who are the winners and losers in a project. And if we then overlay a pricing mechanism, how can we make sure that some of the winners pay according to some of the benefits that they're receiving to not make the situation worse for everybody in the community?
So as you're saying that, one of the things that kind of comes to my mind as a picture would be, let's say with Easy Pass, if there was an overall slightly higher price, but if you got Easy Pass and you had a low income, you got an extra discount. Would that be like one approach that you might go?
Well, I mean, road pricing is sometimes tricky because a lot of the work that I've seen, especially on some of the toll roads, actually the beneficiaries, some of the lower income individuals perceive the toll roads as highly beneficial to them, despite the fact that they have low income and have to pay a relatively high price. But they were willing to pay, not all the time, not on a daily basis, but if they were running late and they knew that they had to pick their son or daughter up from daycare and they needed certainty in travel time, they were certainly willing to pay that. So I think it gets complicated from the perspective of road pricing. I think when we're talking about road pricing, it is true that different income groups are certainly affected differently. But I think we should also start by looking at just, peak versus off-peak demand, for instance, and think about the road as a resource that is used by society. How should that be priced? What is the optimal allocation of resources? How can we use pricing as a mechanism in that case? And then once we're at that point where we have a better, allocated road space, for instance, because of the pricing, then yes, I think it's worth thinking about lower income individuals and how they may be adversely affected, but they're going to be adversely affected by many other policies as well. So maybe that actually requires a broader, sort of societal approach on how to deal with some of those inequities. But yeah, I think road pricing is an interesting example in that case.
Any other concepts or issues?
Well, I think our listeners should just be aware of some of the pitfalls that come along with cost benefit analysis, and some of the games that sometimes can be played in analyses. So I think anybody who reviews a cost benefit analysis is aware that double counting that's one of the pet peeves of mine, that you're looking at projects that all of a sudden come out highly beneficial. And the reason for that is that, the analysis wasn't careful enough to differentiate between different benefits. I think in transportation analysis happens all the time that one, for instance, estimates the time saved as a result of a real new rail line, a new road, or anything along those lines, and counts that in then monetized form, the time saving counted in monetized form, but then also counts the appreciation of, let's say, real estate assets. Well, the reason that real estate gains value from a transportation project is because of the time saving, so that capitalizes into real estate values. So yeah, it's either one. But you should decide which one you want to count, not both, because at that point you're clearly double counting. So that's just one of the pet peeves of mine. And otherwise, I think it's just important to be transparent, to have a clear understanding of what some of these benefits are, and also what the distributional effects are, so that fairness and equity can be considered at one point in time between different stakeholders, but also throughout time, throughout the horizon of the analysis, so that intergenerational equity is a concern for anyone that looks at a large infrastructure project, for example.
Okay. Now, my understanding of cost-benefit analysis, it's sort of the equivalent of you have a stream of sort of net income. The difference between the benefit in a particular moment and the cost in that time period. How would present value calculation be understood differently if we were looking at the wealth, the discounted value of wealth going into the future?
Well, I think one's more of a stock and the other is more of a flow concept, right? So right. Income being more of a flow concept in a particular period, wealth is accumulated income over time as a stock. So I think wealth is just in most cases not really considered, because you're looking at income as from the time unit perspective, saying it's a month, it's a year, it's a quarter, whatever the time period is, and what's the change in wealth, or what's the income for that period, let's say, and that's then subjected to a present value calculation. I think if we're looking at wealth over time, that is sometimes hard to probably put into a cost-benefit framework.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts on, let's say, sustainability and maybe the culture that it expresses?
Well, I mean, in terms of environmental sustainability and cost benefit, I think it's important to realize today in 2020 that there's a lot of benefits that are unmeasured, uncounted, underappreciated, and therefore not made part of benefit cost calculations for a lot of projects. I think, like I was saying before, we have gone a long way as analysts and economists to put, for instance, a price on the social cost of carbon. But there's lots more to it. There's arguments that that's actually still way too low for what it should be. I think there are plenty of distortions that occur in the market system because some of those external costs are not properly valued. There are no markets, the mechanisms, the methodologies by which you could price on them are also they're not complete enough. And I think that results then in bad decisions if one looks towards cost-benefit analysis as the tool. So I think it's important to think about what is not counted, what this means over time, what this means for societies over time, how they grow, how they have different, how the economies change, how the environmental system in which they operate changes over time. So I think it's almost as important to think about what's not counted or what's improperly counted in CBA than what actually shows up on the page when you perform a cost-benefit analysis.
Okay. Would you have any further elaboration on the history of cost-benefit analysis? When was it started to be used? Did we have something like that, in history, but we didn't call it that?
Well, I think, I look at this from more recent history when, government mandated cost-benefit analysis for projects after, up to a certain, above a certain size. I think it's been a tool that has been, that economists have always recognized as long as, some marginal analysis has existed and economists look at a decision from marginal benefit versus marginal cost components. I mean, that's cost-benefit analysis essentially, and that goes back centuries at this point. So I think in more recent history, there's a lot of work that has been done coming out of government directives to use and utilize cost-benefit analysis, and that's when also the methodologies have become much better defined, much more complex, applied to different circumstances. Like I was saying before, there's lots of guidance documents out there. So I think there's a long arc for cost-benefit analysis, and it wasn't always called that necessarily, but we've certainly come a long way now, even considering, some of the problems and some of the biases and some of the ways that cost-benefit analysis that may not capture all aspects of a project. But yeah, it's a long history. It's a great tool. I find it very insightful to use, despite some of the flaws that I was describing.
Do you have any final thoughts or comments you would like to add?
I think we covered a lot of ground. So let me thank you again, David. This was great. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you and talk about cost-benefit analysis and support your podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Alex Heil, Port Authority, New York, New Jersey. Thank you for your time and for
Anytime.
your very deep insights. Much appreciated.
Thank you.